And in this video, I'm going to provide you with a tutorial on heat mechs. First, let's define what a heat mech is. In general, these mechs are going to use weapons which deal explosive damage, but their primary attributes are that they deal enough heat damage to overheat their opponents and have enough heat capacity and cooling that this costs them fewer action points than it does their opponents. By doing this, they are getting more moves than their opponent in every match. So even though heat mechs lack the raw damage output of a physical mech, or the bonus energy damage of an energy mech, they make up for it by getting more attacks than their opponents and limiting their opponent's options on as many turns as possible. So in this video, I'm going to cover general ideas in building heat mechs and how to handle them in battle. Then I'll show you a few different types of heat mechs and discuss how their parts work together to achieve the goal of damaging your opponent by taking away his action points and limiting his options. When building heat mechs, your primary concern needs to be equipping weapons and drones that have good heat differentials. Heat differential is the amount of heat damage done to your opponent minus the amount of heat generated by your own mech. You've also got to make sure that you balance this with the damage output of your weapons. Amazing heat differentials are useless if you have no damage output to go with them. Your second concern is making sure that your mech has the heat capacity and cooling necessary so that you don't end up having to cool just as often as your opponent. Other important considerations in weapons are resistance drain. Because heat weapons don't do as much damage, you are vulnerable to high resistance and resistance kits, and other status effects such as max heat damage and max cooling damage. Other important considerations for your mech are hit points, resistance, and shield. These all work together to keep your mech alive as long as possible so that you can get the most leverage from your advantage. Playing heat mechs is an art. I will give you some basic, general guidelines here, but there is simply too much to cover to give you a complete guide in this short tutorial. Your first turns should focus on getting your drone active, your shield up, a resistance kit, if you have and are going to use one, and using any resistance drainers against your opponent. The order you do these things is going to depend on the type of mech you are facing. For example, against a physical mech, putting your shield up first is often your best bet. From there, you need to focus on your heat, your opponent's heat, and the range between you. It is very important to know off the top of your head how much heat damage your common attack combos, including your drone, are going to do to your opponent, and how much heat they will generate for yourself. This will help you make better decisions about when to attack twice, when to attack once and cool, when to attack once and take another action, or simply when to cool twice. In general, if your opponent will be overheated and have to cool on the next turn, it's a good idea to try to get 2 attacks in on your turn, provided that it will not raise your own heat so high that you run the risk of being double cooled, losing both your action points and consequently your drone attack as well. If your HP is getting low, you can use a situation like this to attack and use your repair kit as well. If you are facing another heat mech and your total heat at the beginning of your turn is more than twice your cooling, you can consider cooling twice on your turn. You're going to have to shed this heat sooner or later, and if you aren't in range of a high damage weapon, this might be a good time to do it. Usually, you only want to do this when your heat is at least twice your cooling. You don't want to waste an action point to get less cooling than your mech is capable of. Just about everything else is situational. Try to keep out of the range of your opponent's high damage weapons, and even better, try to force them to cool so that they can't move you back into range and use the weapon on the same turn. If you have the opportunity to force your opponent to double cool, you are going to want to take it. This is why it's so important to know the heat damage values of your weapons. If you force your opponent to double cool, they not only lose their chance to attack, move, or use kits, they also lose their drone attack. This not only saves you the damage it would have done to you, but also the heat or energy damage as well. So these are some general tips and guidelines for building and playing your heat mechs. Now we'll take a look at a few different types of heat mech builds, and I'll talk about the weapons and other parts that went into them, and tell you how they work together and how they help achieve our goals. So here's one of my current favorite heat mechs. As you can see, it satisfies all of our general objectives in building heat mechs. First, it has weapons that do good heat differential. We have Heat Dissolver Mark II, which, even though it does 22 heat damage to them and to you, reduces their max heat damage by 6, and this adds up quite a bit over time. Another primary weapon is the Rear Hit Heat Mark. This one does 22 heat damage to your opponent and 15 to yourself, while doing relatively decent explosive damage, but it has the added benefits of resistance drain and pull. This will help you control your range against your opponent and also help deal with those pesky resistances, especially those who use kits. Other weapons are your Firewall, which is not a great heat differential with 17 to the opponent and 15 to yourself, but it does do decent damage like the grenade launcher, and also does 2 knockback. So between this and the grenade launcher, you can move people in 1, out 1, or out 2 by using different combinations of your weapons. And then we also have the Firewatch Mark I, which is the mythical resistance drainer. It does primarily 12 resistance drain is its big draw, but it also does a little bit of explosive damage and cooling damage. The downside to this one is it does 15 heat damage to your opponent, but generates 35 heat for yourself. So this one you've got to be a little bit careful when you use. You're going to want to try to use it early on in a match so that you're not overheating yourself. In terms of how we deal with the heat that we generate, this mech has 135 heat capacity, which is fairly low for a heat mech, but it does have 114 cooling. So what you're going to find with this mech is that you're not going to get 2 action points on most of your turns when you're fighting another heat mech. You're going to have to be satisfied with being able to handle only 1 action point each turn, and hopefully over the length of a match, superior cooling, because a lot of heat mechs are going to have high 90s, low 100s, you might be able to eke out an extra action point. Another benefit to this one is it has 870 hit points. This is going to help your mech last a long time, especially combined with the high resistances from the 11-point multi-resist module. It's especially useful against energy mechs. Because this mech's weapons and drone don't rely on energy at all, you're not going to lose out in your ability to do whatever attack you want because an energy mech has drained you. You've also got 19 electric resistance, which is going to help you a lot. The drawback, which is common with most heat mechs, is you've only got 100 energy capacity and 30 regeneration. So you're going to have a lot of bonus energy damage done against you. Now the idea behind a mech like this one has been around for a little bit longer, but it's still very powerful. The idea here is to use the Firewatch to drain your opponent's resistance, further drain it with the use of Meltdown, and then get lots of burst attacks where you use your hook and sword or your teleport and sword to overheat your opponent. What you're going to find is that if you time things just right, you can keep your opponent very immobile, and with the resistance drain you can get very good damage out of this Meltdown. Your main attack is going to be your hook and sword combo. So your hook is going to do 31 heat damage, your sword is going to do another 52, and your drone is going to do another 23. So that's going to add up to 106 heat damage. There aren't too many mechs that are going to be able to handle that and not have to shut down at least once on their next turn. That's going to give you the ability to use a kit, cool yourself, knock them out of range with Meltdown. You've got lots of options. Another really great thing about this mech is its energy and regeneration are very high for a heat mech, and its heat and cooling are still very strong. To take advantage of the high energy and regeneration, this mech has a 25% energy shield. This lends itself very well to the longevity aspect of our heat mechs. Here's another pretty cool type of heat mech. This one goes against the grain a little bit. It focuses a little bit less on heat differential and taking away action points, but makes up for it with raw damage. As you can see, its big feature is 2 Death Punch Mark II. These are fairly uncommon among heat weapons in that they're just about the highest damage output weapons in the game, with a range of 96 to 146 explosive damage, and then they do 5 resistance drain and 54 heat damage. The cost is 30 rockets for each one, so it's not light in terms of rocket cost, but they sure pack a punch. Any turn where you can get 2 of these in is going to devastate your opponent with 108 heat damage plus whatever you get from your drone and upwards of 300 damage in some cases. After getting your opponent's hit points down from the death punches, the goal is to finish them off at range. Use your firewall to push them back. Ideally, push them back to range 5 or 6, and then move yourself out to range 7, where the Mayhem battery and Mark 1, 2, or 3 will work fine. You can use this to hopefully keep their heat up and keep them cooling every turn with its 34 heat damage, and it does pretty reasonable explosive damage as well with a range of 54 to 75. And over time, with the 3 resistance drain, it's going to wear your opponents down to the point where it's doing pretty good damage at the end of the match. I've paired it here with Sector Eye, which is the rocket heat drone. It doesn't have any energy consumption, which is a big bonus, and uses only 5 rockets for 40 damage and 25 heat damage. You can see this mech has a little bit fewer hit points. It has very low energy and regeneration, so it's vulnerable to energy mechs for that reason. And one of the main reasons I say that it goes against some of the advice that I gave in general terms, it has only 158 heat capacity and only 86 cooling. So against other heat mechs, you're going to have to really pay attention to your heat and make sure that they don't get a chance to double cool you, and certainly not often. By going against those general rules, it allows for these death punches when, especially if you're playing 2v2 or 3v3, if you've got this as your second or third mech, once you've finished off one of your opponent's mechs and got the damage bonus, those death punches really shine. And you're going to find that this mech will catch up big deficits in hit points if you find yourself behind. So by now, some of you might be saying, well, these builds are all well and good, but what is a guy supposed to do if he doesn't have any mythicals to make a mech? Here's one just for you. This mech doesn't have any parts that aren't available from regular item boxes. As you can see, even unfused, it has 600 hit points almost, 95 energy with 66 regeneration, which is good enough to use a 20% energy shield. It has 140 heat with 83 cooling. The 25 rocket capacity is actually wasted in this mech because it doesn't have any rocket weapons, but Galaxus is still the best torso to use for this build, and it does have the benefit of 6 extra explosive resistance. For weapons, it has Infernal Mark II paired with the Advanced Burning Harpoon Mark IV, which is the highest level legendary heat hook. So the combination of that doing 38 heat damage, and the Inferno with 65, and the triple laser pointer with 22 is a pretty devastating heat attack. Then what you've got is you've got two weapons to use in the mid-range and knock back that don't use any energy, and the blue shredder beam has a nice bonus of doing lots of damage. Then for the longer range, you've got the rear hit heat mark to pull guys back in, and you can pair that with your blue shredder beam. You've also got the Fire Stampede, which does nice 60 explosive damage, which is pretty good for a pair of legs, combined with 25 heat damage, and it's adding a little bit of hit points to your mech as well. So here's an example of something that can be done without any myths, and I think you'll find that it'll do pretty well in PvP matchups.